will be presented by Brigadier General retired John W. Carlson, sitting to my left. As you know, MacArthur commanded the Southwest Pacific Theater in World War II. He administered post-war Japan during the Allied occupation that followed, and led the United Nations forces during the first 9 months of the Korean War. Now, Brigadier General Carlson's military career spanned nearly 44 years, ending with his retirement in 1993. He was commissioned in 1954 after graduating from Artillery Officers Candidate School at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, then graduated from Air Defense Center, Fort Bliss, Texas, Engineer School at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, Defense Information School Command and General Staff College and Army War College. He is in Halls of Fame at Fort Sill and Fort Meade, Maryland. General Carlson graduated with honors, earning a Bachelor of Arts degree in Communications from local Curry College. Many of you may know or remember him, but his radio and television broadcast career included stints as voice of the New England Patriots just after converting from the Boston Patriots and Minnesota Vikings. His career highlights were, or among his career highlights, were broadcasting the Super Bowl, World Series, NBA and NHL playoffs, NCAA basketball, and hockey tournaments. His documentary writing earned a pair of awards, and his reporting for CBS Radio brought 6 Best Reporting Awards. He has many additional awards, which I will not go into and like to give him the time. So now, please join me in welcoming General John Carlson.
Thank you very much, Phil, and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back here in Lexington, an historic town. I come from an historic town as well, Braintree, the birthplace of the father of West Point, Sylvanus Thayer. But also, little known, I think, is that John Adams was born in Braintree. We do have his birth certificate in the town clerk's safe, along with that of John Quincy Adams and that of John Hancock. So we proudly celebrate that in Braintree, but we do it rather quietly because everybody thinks they came from the city of presidents, so-called Quincy, which was somewhat like the South, of course, trying to split away from the Union. They split away from Dame Braintree and went off on their own, and haven't done so well ever since, I might add. I'd like to also introduce my audio-visual technician here today, who's a retired colonel from the United States Army. This is Dick Power, who was observing Veterans Day this week as well as so many of us. And he's a technical whiz, and he's also a wizard at financial planning, which is his new occupation ever since he moved from the Army to his own business, which thrives, I might add, and I really appreciate his being here today. Today we're here to talk about General Douglas A. MacArthur. He was General of the Army, MacArthur. When Japan attacked, he led us back to victory. As Viceroy, he led Japan into a new era of democracy. When Korea exploded, we turned to him again. Of course, he has kind of mixed reviews throughout history. To this day, there are those who think he was a dangerous demagogue and others who say that he was one of the greatest men who ever lived. And there's little doubt that he affected the lives of millions all over the world, many of whom do not even know his name. Duty, honor, country. William Manchester dubbed MacArthur an American Caesar. Harry Truman dubbed him Dugout Doug, Stuffed Shirt, Mr. Prima Donna, Brass Hat, 5-Star MacArthur. Harry gave everybody hell, I guess, during his time. He was also known as our first soldier. He was larger than life. He had an ego to match. He hunted for greatness. And today we'll begin his story at its end. MacArthur in a theater of war, played all the roles. He was the producer, the director, and the star. He was, Joseph Goulden wrote in his book, Korea, the most complex United States military man ever. His career spanned 3 major wars, and his fate dealt him his closing hand. He was 70 years old, ruling Japan. He hadn't seen the United States in 13 years, not even for a parade. His absence simply added to the myth of MacArthur. In June of 1950, North Korea struck against the South. MacArthur was made the UN forces commander, and with United States troops pinned in the then called Pusan perimeter, he planned a 5,000 to 1 shot to gain leverage over the invaders. It would be a daring amphibious assault at Incheon, near Seoul, where if the timing failed, the assault would end up sitting in squishy mud because of the 30-foot tides there, much like our bay in Canada just north of here. Well, he tossed the dice, and Incheon became a brilliant success. The date was September 15th, 1950. By October 15th, the enemy was reeling, and Harry Truman and MacArthur met for the very first time at a place called Wake Island, made famous during the Second World War, as you all know. They discussed the war and the chances of China coming into the war if we crossed the 38th parallel, which had been made kind of a bugaboo line, and MacArthur assured Truman that China wouldn't step in. Truman pinned a medal on him, and he left. The very next day, 200,000 Chinese slipped into North Korea, and MacArthur's Home by Christmas offensive ran into Mao Zedong's army. The war's darkest days followed. The Chinese turned the flank of 10th Corps, and then outflanked and trapped the 1st Marine Division at a place called the Chosin Reservoir. We face an entirely new war, MacArthur said. No kidding. Well, he was fighting the limits that were imposed on him then, and perhaps some of you remember the fact that he was unable to bomb within certain areas, and 5-mile zone around the Yalu River was included, which meant that he could never interdict the Chinese forces that taking out the bridges and interdicting, of course, as well their supply lines. He fought vigorously against that restriction, but lost. Truman, you see, was leaning toward containment, and containment was something that was averse to the nature of MacArthur, who sought victory, even if he had to use atomic bombs, or the Chinese nationalist troops that were standing by, more or less, at Taiwan. Matter of fact, one of the things that went on about the atomic bomb included Harry Truman's thoughts as well. Not a lot of people knew, certainly around that period of time, that Harry Truman himself had warned Mao that he could drop atomic bombs. And not a lot of people knew that he had actually sent an atomic bomb on an aircraft carrier to the China Sea so that it would be ready to put together and to be used just in case. Mao sent Harry Truman a message. He said, use as many atomic bombs as you want. I'll throw hand grenades and beat you. Well, MacArthur launched a February 1951 offensive, sending U.S. troops into Seoul for the 4th time in what had become pretty much of a yo-yo war. But as Truman was bidding for a ceasefire, his general was threatening China with all-out war. Truman was livid. Now, remember that Truman didn't like generals in general. But he's now dealing with one who had said that he was running Japan better than Truman was running the United States. Now, of course, you can assume that Harry didn't like that. But MacArthur told him at Wake Island that if a general did run against him, it would be Eisenhower, not MacArthur. Then in March, a bombshell was dropped. Big surprise, it came from a National Security Agency intercept of cables sent by Portuguese and Spanish envoys in Tokyo bearing MacArthur's words about fixing the Chinese question through a major war. If the Soviets came in, that too could be settled, he said to those envoys. Truman saw red when he got the dispatch, but acting could then expose this new NSA station which had been created in Atsugi, Japan, and he didn't want that to happen, so he remained silent about it. But then MacArthur took some snipes at the 8th Army commander, General Matthew Ridgway's war plan, and he called Truman's peace steps a disgrace, a sellout, saying that the hang-up over crossing the 38th parallel was an absurdity. Things weren't going so well when the Joint Chiefs sent him a communique asking him to comment on a ceasefire offer. He simply ignored them and didn't respond. Calling China a vastly overrated military power, certain to lose, MacArthur then urged the enemy to meet him on the battlefield. We were drawing back to the days of Hannibal against the Roman Empire in this instance. Finally, a letter that he sent to Joseph Martin, the Speaker of the House, Republican from Attleboro, Massachusetts. As you probably all know, he was asking for use of Formosa's Chinese nationalist army. Well, this was really what ended it for General Douglas MacArthur. The letter's final line was, "There is no substitute for victory." There was, though, a substitute for General MacArthur, and his name was General Matt Ridgway. Harry Truman said, "The son of a bitch isn't going to resign on me. He's going to be fired."
General Douglas MacArthur comes home to his native land. San Francisco stages its mightiest reception, a tumultuous, cheering demonstration that sets the key for the nation's welcome.
Julius Caesar was not received in Rome any better than General MacArthur was received all over this country.
It is the first time in 14 years that MacArthur has been on the American mainland. Two-thirds of the public say they are outraged by the firing, at least in part because of the way in which the general received the news. A series of embarrassing bureaucratic missteps result in MacArthur hearing of his dismissal not through official channels, but over the radio.
It is past midnight in Washington, but the MacArthurs find a welcoming throng of 12,000 at National Airport.
MacArthur's address before Congress is a masterpiece of political theater, at once defiant, yet filled with self-pity. His military career shattered, the defeated but proud MacArthur defends himself to the very end.
Efforts have been made to distort my position. It has been said in effect that I was a warmonger. Nothing could be further from the truth.
While 20 million people watch on TV, MacArthur bitterly ends his career by remembering the favorite military ballad, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away."
tried to do his duty as God gave him the right to see that duty. Goodbye.
To Truman's relief, MacArthur's star does eventually fade away. In 7 weeks of Senate hearings, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other witnesses destroy MacArthur's credibility and back the president's decision to fire the American hero.
So just who was this man with such powerful beliefs that he rose against a president? They're linked together in history forever. The man we're talking about swore to support and defend the Constitution, but he did rise against the president. It's the reason that he was fired, actually. He was a man who faced brutal enemy fire unarmed, but dared not face his mother. He was vain and histrionic and dubbed a great captain of history, a man who played at suicide, who wrote battle plans and poetry, whose passion was duty, honor, country. Douglas MacArthur was born on an Army post in 1880 in Arkansas near Little Rock to Captain Arthur and Mary MacArthur. The first sound he recalled ever hearing was a bugle call. Dad wore a Civil War Medal of Honor, earned as a 19-year-old Wisconsin militia lieutenant in a battle in Tennessee, where the bearer of the national colors fell, shot dead as they charged up the hill. And Arthur MacArthur grabbed the colors, raised them on high, and shouted, "On Wisconsin." And today, that's the fight song of the University of Wisconsin. On Wisconsin. I'd hum it for you, but that probably will get old too fast. Maybe I'll imitate a bugle call. Mother Mary became his rock, and he became Mary's magnum opus. She bred in him a quest for greatness. The family was posted on the frontier when he was 4 years old. His dad led troops from a New Mexico fort. You can imagine the sight of John Wayne leading his cavalry to the sounds of "She Wore a Yellow Ribbon," heading out to face Geronimo and his Apaches. But that's what Douglas MacArthur was seeing when his dad was going out. As a matter of fact, Douglas, during those days in New Mexico, stood reveille with his father each and every day. His father stayed in the Army after the Civil War and was a captain for some 25 years before he was promoted to major. Promotions came hard in those days of a shrunken Army and shrunken interest in having an Army. In the Philippines, though, in the Spanish-American War, he fought, and he stayed there as the Governor General of the Philippines. We see Douglas here in his youth. He did attend high school at a Texas military academy. His brother Arthur was an Annapolis graduate, and he was in the Navy when Douglas won a seat at West Point in the class of 1903. And he finished first with historic high grades while braving the kind of pestering and harassment that goes on with a general's son. His father was busy fighting Aguinaldo's guerrillas in the Philippines when a presidential envoy, a Judge William Howard Taft, came on a mission to decide if civilians should replace the Army in the Philippines. This did not make Arthur MacArthur a happy camper. he had his casualties, he had his problems, but he was an Army man, and the Army ought to be there. And when this rotund fellow, whom he thought was particularly clueless, came calling, he was less than a gracious host. For instance, he assigned quarters to Judge Taft. The smallest room in the billet was what he got. As a matter of fact, Taft, who was, of course, if you recall, when he was president, they had to put a special bathtub in the White House so that he could fit in and have a bath. He was pretty tubby. And in this room, he could not enter the room forthwith, but rather had to slide in sideways to get inside the room. You can think about how uncomfortable that might have been in the heat of the Philippines. For one thing, and changing clothes and stuff could get to be a significant task. He probably had to do it in the hallway. At any rate, it was a costly error. Taft went back to Washington and had him recalled. And later, as Taft assumed the position of Secretary of War, he squashed Arthur MacArthur's long-desired promotion to Chief of Staff. It crushed MacArthur. He was the senior man in the Army, and in those days the senior man had dibs on that top job, and he didn't get it. He died in 1912, and he left instructions that he was not to be buried in his Army uniform after spending his life from the time that he was 19 years old till then in the United States Army. He was particularly bitter. You have to understand that Douglas remembered his father's fate, and though usually respectful, he never really, I don't think, trusted politicians. He was an engineer officer, of course. By then, West Point was producing our engineers, and he was a pretty good leader. He was fearless, he was intense, he was patriotic, and he even became a demolition expert. He wrote a tome on demolitions for the Army back during that time. He was in hand-to-hand clashes with Filipino guerrillas. He emerged alive from a kill-or-be-killed gunfight with Pancho Villas, or Villas, if you'd like, at Veracruz bandits. He was recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor from that action, but that was turned down. He did not get it. He got the next best, which the Distinguished Service Cross is certainly not an award to be sniffed at. Joining the Army staff, and I think kind of early, really, but nonetheless, remember he was the son of a general, and he was toting those high grades from West Point in his experience. He was actually the first public affairs officer in the United States Army. He was selected for that job because of his skill at both writing and speaking. And he once addressed that. As a matter of fact, he was talking about, when asked about his abilities in those areas, he said, "My father, General Arthur MacArthur, commended to me just two things: to learn to write and speak the English language effectively. And," he said modestly, "this I did." He was cited for getting the Draft Act of 1917 passed. He recommended and then was instrumental in building a National Guard division from a rainbow of states, 5 states actually, and sailed to France as a colonel, the chief of staff of World War I's 42nd Rainbow Division. But jealousy over his rapid rise was making some enemies for him in the Army Officer Corps, and then he got one too. In a little aside, he also intended for the 42nd Division to be the first division to land in France to join the Allied Expeditionary Force. A new Army division was the first division there. That was the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division. And he was going to be the 1st Guard Division. However, the commander of the National Guard here in feisty New England, a man named General Clarence Edwards, When he got his orders to take the 26th, what they called then the New England Division, to North Carolina, a place called Camp Green, where they were going to train a little longer, he, at 58 years old and being a West Point graduate and never having been in a conflict, decided that was not for him. He's not going to some damn training base. He's going to France. So he went to the piers at Bayonne, New Jersey, and sent a little delegation to the St. Lawrence River, and he commandeered some ships. He had to, of course, grease some palms, as we used to say. And he got the ships, and he put the Yankee division, soon to be called, in those ships, and was the first Guard division to land in France. You can see the boiling point reached by MacArthur and the steam coming out his ears when he learned that his division was not going to be first. Clarence Edwards was already there. Clarence Edwards' reward for that initiative, by the way, caused the then Allied Expeditionary Force commander, the great General Blackjack Pershing, to see to it that Edwards was the only division commander in the First World War not to receive the Distinguished Service Medal. MacArthur got there, and he, unlike chiefs of staff then or since, led patrols himself, and attacks too, winning over his men and annoying his bosses. Later, as a general commanding a brigade in that division, he made his mark. AEF Commander Pershing, who frowned on MacArthur's dances with danger, he had decided that generals were just too doggone expensive to have running up in the front of an attack and getting killed. Replacing them was getting to be difficult. He didn't want to do that. And so he kind of leaned on MacArthur. He wanted the officers back, not in the front. And he ordered MacArthur to take this heavily defended Côte de Châtillon, thick with 230 machine gun nests, pill boxes, and walled with barbed wire. Pershing said, "You take that hill or give me a list of 5,000 casualties." And MacArthur said, "We'll take that hill or my name will head that list." He led a patrol out over no man's land, probing for weaknesses, and found a soft spot, a place where he thought they could exploit their attack. And he started to turn to get his men to go back with him when all of a sudden fire began raining down on them. They had been spotted by the Germans. He called for his men to follow him out, but nobody was coming, so he went from hole to hole and found them all dead. He was the only survivor. He returned to plan and lead the brigade in a gallant charge against that hill. Now, this is the way he went up that hill. And remember his father in Tennessee in the Civil War, charging up the hill, carrying a flag, and nothing. He was unarmed, in essence, at that point. Now, Douglas MacArthur, wearing his West Point letter sweater, he lettered in baseball at West Point, and a scarf around his neck that his mama knit for him. Without a helmet, he had the soft cap with the bill, and without a gas mask, he took the point armed with a riding crop and led the charge. Now, he's either crazy or incredibly brave. You've got maybe a mixture of both. At any rate, Châtillon fell at a cost of 4,000 casualties. Later, he wrote about that. He wrote a line which I thought was impressive: "Death, cold and relentless, whistled and sung its way through our ranks." 4,000 casualties were taken, and for the rest of his life, the mention of that day caused his eyes to fill with tears. An officer board recommended him for the Medal of Honor. General Pershing said no. He hadn't killed anyone. But nonetheless, at the end of the war, Douglas MacArthur was the Army's most decorated officer. Post-war, he was assigned as the superintendent of West Point by John Pershing, who had become Chief of Staff of the Army. And he charged MacArthur to bring West Point into the 20th century. MacArthur became an eager reformer. He shed the old school objections he was getting from the old school grads, and he began altering what he saw as a provincial reformatory based on fear, and using his dad's dictum to do what's right no matter the cost, he went forth and started to reform the academy. This is a look at him and then her. Oh, look, that's Louise Brooks. He met her somewhere during that time, West Point, of course, being in close proximity to New York City. And Louise was a rich divorcee socialite. It was love at very first sight. They were married. Mom moved out of West Point and let the new wife come in to live with Doug. Nice of her. Doug, unhappily, would soon follow. General Pershing was not pleased about this relationship, and though he was invited to the Palm Beach wedding, he snubbed it, as did Mom. Then he took Douglas out of a job that MacArthur loved and sent him packing to the Philippines, where there really wasn't any job. They didn't even assign him a job. Let's go to the Philippines. He'd been there and had done that. He made a task on his own. He began the planning and mapping of the defense of the Philippine Islands. But why on earth would Pershing do that? And some doubt this, but it's, I think, the only rational explanation. Louise had had a wartime affair in Paris. It was kind of known underneath here and there that it was with John Pershing. Now, some people tried to pin it on Pershing's aide, that she was interested in this first lieutenant. Louise Brooks didn't get interested in first lieutenants. This Louise Brooks was a general's lady, and it seems to me it was pretty obvious that Blackjack didn't want Louise around, no matter how cute she was. Well, when a year or so later, Douglas's brother, who was a Navy captain, Arthur MacArthur, died from appendicitis, Mom urged Pershing to bring Douglas back, please. I have no one else. Arthur's gone. Her youngest son died at that post in New Mexico when a measles epidemic swept through. All she had was Doug. Her husband, of course, had died in 1912. She wanted him back home, and he brought him back home, and actually then promoted him, maybe feeling a little remorse at the time, promoted him to Major General to boot. Well, now Louise is getting kind of unhappy with this military life and its limits, and urged Douglas to quit the Army. She had a job for him, a sinecure at her family's Wall Street firm, but as did his father. When Mary asked him to quit the Army, he said, absolutely not. Unlike Mom, Louise said, so long, soldier. But everything kind of went along well at that point, because a happy ending came, if you can call it that. Here's Douglas MacArthur being sworn in 1930 as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. The job that Dad wanted and could not get, he got. And he began fighting to modernize the Army, but of course there wasn't any money. We had had the great crash in October of 1929. There was no dough so he couldn't go with his modernization program the way he wanted to. Then, if you recall, because it made all the history books, he confronted World War I vets who marched on the Capitol seeking bonus money, and that caused the national fuss, and some people wondered why he did it. Well, he thought a lot of soldiers, and he thought they were degrading the name of soldier, it seems to me, from readings on that particular period, and he didn't like that. He also knew, of course, that money was promised in the 1940s, and this was kind of early, but they wanted the money because they needed the money, and it was a problem. He went on to restore the Purple Heart Medal, which had faded from view in the United States Army, and he warned the administration that the world's 18th largest army, that would be our army at the time, it later fell to position 19, couldn't defend the United States. And he was right, of course. And he also took a mistress. Her name was Dimples. And later he paid Dimples and a news columnist to keep their mouth shut, lest his mother find out. Well, in 1935, he was done as the Chief of Staff of the Army, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt shipped him to Manila. And on the ship, he met Miss Jean Faircloth of Tennessee, his wife-to-be. She called him "my general." Mom died that year in Manila. 2 years later, he buried her at Arlington, married Jean, and started an argument with FDR over money for Manila and the Filipino Army. Well, he lost. He lost the argument. He went back to the Philippines. He resigned from the United States Army. He became Field Marshal of the ragtag Filipino Army. It was 1937. But his secretary, Major Dwight Eisenhower, dismayed by it all, went home. It's interesting because a lot of the people think that would have caused Douglas MacArthur to give a thumbs down to Dwight Eisenhower, but I read the final efficiency report that MacArthur wrote on Eisenhower in the summer of 1937. That would be his termination with the United States Army. And what he wrote was, in the event of war, this officer should immediately be promoted to the rank of general. So despite whatever problems they had, MacArthur recognized that Eisenhower had the seeds of greatness within. In 1941, Japan's intent was pretty clear, and FDR got MacArthur out of the Filipino milieu and made him the Far East Army commander, pledging reinforcements. But deep pain was going to come to MacArthur from this, from what he saw as his destiny, a chance to triumph and a chance, of course, to reach greatness. But his plans, based on pledges of support from supply, foresaw being ready by April of 1942. Unfortunately, Japan attacked the Philippines one day after they attacked Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941, and rolled over unready troops. How unready were they? Well, he had a terrible mission to try and create, and because it had to do with Bataan, I mentioned some people that I had a chance to interview several years ago at White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico. It was a group of people who were in the Bataan Death March. They were all from the New Mexico National Guard. They have an annual race there through the desert, the marathon. They call it the Bataan Death March Memorial Marathon. And I had a son running in the marathon with his Air Force unit. And I got a chance to talk to, there were over 30 survivors of the Death March there. And they came from a regiment in New Mexico of horse cavalry. They had 900 and some odd men in that regiment, but they were all horsemen. They were all there riding the deserts and preparing for the great cavalry charge that never came. And they got activated when they started calling National Guard units in 1940. They got activated, they got sent to Fort Bliss, Texas. All their horses were taken away. I don't know, they got maybe passed out to cowboys or to glue factories, but nonetheless, no horses anymore. Gentlemen, you are now anti-aircraft artillerymen. The problem was they didn't have any guns for them to train on, and they hadn't any ammunition if they had guns to train them on. They were just anti-aircraft artillerymen, and they were going to school seeing pictures and descriptions on the blackboard and learning some of the art of artillery without actually firing any artillery pieces. In the fall of 1941, they were shipped to the Philippines. When they got to Manila and went out to their duty sites, for the first time, they saw 90-millimeter guns. They had to decosmoline those guns. If any of you have worked on cosmoline and guns, you know what a sloppy mess that is. That's no fun. But they still couldn't, when they got the guns ready to fire, they still couldn't fire because they had not enough ammunition to practice with. They had to keep their ammunition in case they needed it. And there came a day when they actually needed it. December 8th, 1941, the first time that they ever fired those guns. Well, you know what happened in the Philippines, and it was distressful. These fellows were great guys and had senses of humor and all. It was years later, of course, and so on. They were terrific, and they told their stories, I might say, very, very well. But here they are in this position, and a retreat to Bataan was too slow, so they lost their supplies on the way as they were heading to Bataan and Corregidor. The supplies were lost, and so was hope, really. The doomed were just buying time. MacArthur was begging Washington for help, but he was told the Navy was doing its best and that help would come later from Australia. Well, Forrest Pogue, who was George Marshall's biographer, wrote, "It was like telling a man dying of thirst that he must wait until a well was dug and a water main laid." Marshall in Washington was sensing the problem here, the propaganda tool that MacArthur would become if he was captured by the Japanese and put in a cage and marched through the streets of Tokyo. He couldn't envision allowing that to happen, and he ordered him to get out. And MacArthur sent him a message saying absolutely not. He would share the fate of the garrison, he and his family. He had his wife and son there. Finally, MacArthur convinced FDR that he had to get him out of there, and he told him why, and FDR agreed. And FDR ordered him out of there, and MacArthur still said no, but his staff said, "You got to go because you're the only hope we've got." So as you know, FDR gave us a hero and sent him on a dangerous PT boat ride through treacherous enemy waters, and he awarded MacArthur the Medal of Honor that he had been turned down for twice in his past. So we had a hero. MacArthur's mantra became, "I shall return." MacArthur worked assiduously to get approval for that return. Any of you that saw the motion picture MacArthur, with Gregory Peck doing a great job as MacArthur. What a great actor. And a great story. The movie's a little long, but nonetheless. He was fighting George Marshall, he was fighting the Navy, he was fighting anybody with a religious, righteous fervor to keep his pledge of Philippine liberation and free his battling bastards of Bataan. He won the debate against some tough rivals, and he did it not by his eloquence alone, but by bringing up the facts and describing them in good order his competence, his analysis was right. He scored big by taking the Admiralties and New Guinea and taking limited casualties in both of those operations despite limited naval support, but with skilled use of air power thanks to General Kenny, his air commander, who was brilliant in his own right during the course of that time. And now MacArthur would keep his pledge. It was on to the Philippines.
On October 20th, MacArthur went ashore, the last four-star general to exercise command of the front. His 2.5-year quest was over.
People of the Philippines, I have returned. Rally to me. Let the indomitable spirit of Japan bring it all on. Rise and strike. For future generations of your sons and daughters, strike. In the name of your sacred dead, strike. Let no heart be faint, let every arm be steel.
10 days after the landing, the MacArthur communique said Leyte was secure. But the fighting, journalists noted, had hardly begun. The elections are coming up in a few days, a press officer explained. If MacArthur had made a deal to give FDR good news before the election, he delivered on that day.
Speaking of the glorious operations in the Philippines, I wonder whatever became of the suggestion made a few weeks ago that I had failed for political reasons to send enough forces or supplies to General MacArthur.
In December, Roosevelt promoted MacArthur and his other top generals and admirals to 5-star rank.
5-star MacArthur took Manila, then began plans for Operation Coronet, the invasion of Japan. But an atom bomb, which had been kept secret from him, ended the war. He wasn't particularly happy having been left out of the net on that particular subject. Nonetheless, he took Japan's surrender in a ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. I know it's there.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. If you look at the lineup of generals and admirals on the deck of the Missouri, these are men who had personal losses at the hands of the Japanese. What MacArthur did was to create a ceremony of victory to show these men that they had achieved this marvelous success, but also to show them that there was a transition in the peacetime period and their behavior and their view of Japan was going to have to become quite different. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding.
General Wainwright getting the first pen.
Extreme dignity with carefully chosen words. At no point said anything that could be interpreted as gloating, interpreted as fighting a beaten enemy. I thought it was the most dramatic, most moving ceremony I've ever witnessed.
For me, who expected the worst humiliation, diplomat Toshikazu Kase remembered, this was a complete surprise. For the living heroes and dead martyrs of the war, this speech was a wreath of undying flowers. This narrow quarterdeck was now transformed into an altar of peace.
And so the war came to an end, VJ Day, and that ceremony in September of 1945. But now General MacArthur would assume a role calling into play his enormous talents, his intelligence, creativity. It was a topping, really, for a stunning career. This one's coming from Japan. It takes a little longer.
On September 8, 1945, MacArthur arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo with a new title, SCAP, Supreme Commander Allied Powers, and a new challenge, rehabilitating and democratizing a country of 70 million people.
And he threw himself physically and emotionally into every problem, no matter how small it was. And he also sought perfection in everything.
I tried to remember the lessons my own father had taught me as military governor of the Philippines, MacArthur recalled. Arthur MacArthur, a successful reformer, had been removed after a bitter quarrel with Washington.
And there you have it. In a mere 5 years, MacArthur led this beaten feudal empire back from the ashes of defeat. And his deft and tough and polite and progressive hand lifted the rising sun with a keen experiment in social, political, fiscal, economic, legal, and education reform. 5 years from ruin to democracy, with a constitution and a Bill of Rights and women's suffrage. It seemed a terrific ending, but fate did not allow. Like his father before him, a clash with a politician ended the story. Thank you. Phil said I might be on the firing line, so if anybody has any questions, I'm certainly willing to answer them. Yes, sir.
Did he have an alternative to the Navy's island hopping campaign?
An alternative.
An alternative where he would have gone maybe along the coast of Vietnam to China to Formosa, rather than come straight across the ocean?
Well, he had, first of all, part of his argument was that he was not going to go in any direction other than the Philippines. And he convinced the president, and I think he probably convinced Admiral Nimitz too, that was the right thing to do. And so he did his island hopping through the Admiralties, and it was in the, if you pardon me, that is what we used to call in Army lingo, haul ass and bypass, and that's what he did, and used air power to significant advantage. And General Kenny gets a lot of credit for that. MacArthur was, reading about for instance, the Billy Mitchell incident. He sat on Billy Mitchell's court-martial, and Billy Mitchell was the advocate of air power after the First World War, and he put himself out on the line on that with both the Navy and the Army, And a lot of the old guard, you know, they thought that was nonsense. We've got mules and horses, and don't worry about it. MacArthur sat on that court-martial board. It was later learned that that MacArthur was the sole vote in favor of Billy Mitchell out of the board of officers that sat in judgment on Mitchell. He knew Mitchell. They had a relationship of some nature because of the fact that Mitchell was from Wisconsin, and so too was, of course, part of the family heritage of Douglas MacArthur. So they had kind of a link between the two of them. But he didn't really get credit for that, which was really, it saved a lot of lives, a lot of casualties. Some people appreciated it and others didn't pay too much attention to it, and some others blamed him for the whole thing in the Pacific, which of course he didn't have a hand in. Yes, sir?
What was his actual title during the occupation? And a second question, how did they prevail upon him to leave Corregidor to Australia? When he,
I'm sorry, I missed that phrase you just...
How did they get him to leave the Philippines to go to Australia after the peninsula was being overrun by the Japanese? He didn't want to leave.
Yes, he wouldn't leave on the word of General Marshall, but and he was not going to leave on the order of the president, but his staff convinced him that he had to do it. He was willing to stay there. He was this guy was an unusual man, really. He was a man from another century. He was a 19th century man who had been out on the frontier in his childhood, and he had a different view of things, and he was going to stay there. And finally they said, "You got to go and get out of here." So he did. But that was, I think, partly loyalty to his staff. Some people thought it was cowardice. I don't think so at all. But anyways, yes, sir.
Can you comment on the story about whose airplane landed first when Truman and MacArthur met in the Pacific?
Oh, no, I remember that was a story, and I can't remember that little detail. Sorry. I look as though I'm old enough to have been there, but I wasn't. I
heard both sides. And I once asked Clark Clifford at a conference at the Kennedy Library. He was Truman's Secretary of State. He said there was nothing to it. And yet I've heard documentaries on TV.
Yeah, that said MacArthur kept Truman waiting, and and so on. Yeah, there was one.
I certainly commend you for doing a tremendous research for this. You brought back a lot of memory to us World War II guys.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. World War II was a fascination for me. I spent a good deal of time at his museum, which a lot of people question what the heck is a MacArthur Museum doing in Norfolk, Virginia, home of the Atlantic Fleet. And it's because Mary MacArthur was a Virginian, and he got the offer. They were giving him the old city hall and for the monument. So when he did his planning and all, he went back to Mama's place, Norfolk, Virginia. Yes.
Was he subordinate to Nimitz, and could you speak to the relationship they had?
Now their relationship was, and Nimitz, of course, was the sink pack and commanded the Pacific Fleet, as you know, and MacArthur had the southeast Asia field. So they were in different. But Nimitz had to approve of things like his maneuvers. Nimitz at first was a part of the battle. They didn't want him to go to the Philippines. They wanted him to go the other way, and he won that. You probably, if you saw the movie MacArthur, he won that with the president and all back over in Hawaii. I had another point, but it's escaped me. It could be age, Bill. I'm not sure, or the fact that I'm a member of the Zipper Club now.
How did they get along?
Oh, they got along. As a matter of fact, it's an interesting thing because, and I have something here that if I could address it with that, if I can find it. There was a piece that was written by John Steinbeck on MacArthur in 1951. I thought it would be interesting to give you a piece of that. Because Steinbeck didn't like MacArthur. And as you know, a lot of people didn't like MacArthur. That was not unusual, I think. And with a figure like MacArthur, I guess, well, there'd be two camps. And Steinbeck was in one. He said of MacArthur coming back in his speech before Congress, which I thought was very well done. Some didn't like it, but Steinbeck was one of the some. This is a frightful political build-up, and only now does its purpose begin to be apparent, he wrote. It is sad to see the awful machinations of the little-souled men, that big hunk of sacrosanct crap, will be making the air horrid with his platitudes. I get such a sense of dishonesty from this man. Wonder what his wife thinks of him. He will be pen-jammering around about today. It will be noisy. I'll have to set my book against the yammer. The old name for radio. And he says, these same crowds who shriek for him today will turn on him tomorrow. Well, this was John Steinbeck. Now,